Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I come to you today with a tag that has been going around BookTube lately, the Pain Over Joy reading tag. Although a lot of the folks in my feed have struggled with some of the questions, the tag has created a wonderful conversation. So many of the versions I've seen have been just brilliant. In fact, I ended my day yesterday and started my morning today with a few amazing examples. I'm not sure I will really address all of the questions, but I do want to add a couple of at least tangentially related ideas to the conversation. First, I don't agree with the basic premise made by Jessica, the originator of this tag over at the channel Lady Lovestead Reads. She argues that we as readers often, quote, value content that elevates pain over joy, as she says. She suggests that we've been socialized to value suffering and intensity and to poo-poo pleasure. To be honest, this is the absolute opposite of what I see in Western culture, at least in American culture. Over and over, we hear that sadness is an emotion we should not feel, and if we do have to feel them, we should not express them to others. I watch people around me say over and over that they feel they can't talk publicly about what hurts them most in their lives without others telling them that they have to have hope or to appreciate what they have. Yes, appreciating what we have is definitely important, but not when that appreciation is supposed to silence our grieving. Even when people are diagnosed with terminal illnesses and are trying to grapple with what might even be weeks or months before their lives end, they and their families are told they must remain sure that God will keep them alive and that they must have hope. Grappling with our realities, even when it means grappling with pain, doesn't really seem to be allowed. I often label this kind of attitude the Disneyfication of our culture. Instead of accepting that we live in a complex world full of joy and also full of suffering and anger and conflict, apparently we're all supposed to live on Main Street, USA, which has no poverty, no diversity, and no violence. I think it was Jen at the BookTube channel Remembered Reads that pointed out that pretending like there is only joy and therefore erasing pain or suffering or injustice is not a good thing. I was extremely moved this morning when I watched a version of this tag put out by the new booktuber Aaron Facer, who I will link to below in the description box. He quoted a line from Tom York of Radiohead, who has experienced a lot of pain in his life, including the death of his very young wife to cancer a few years ago. What York says is both a political statement and a humane one. Quote, "You know you're in trouble when people stop listening to sad music," he says, because the moment people stop listening to sad music, they don't want to know anymore. They're turning themselves off. It's essential that we engage in the world, trying to end some of its conflicts and injustices, but also trying to understand and empathize with the suffering that exists in our midst. Yes, absolutely, all of that pain is mixed with moments of great joy. And we need to celebrate those moments and celebrate the fact that our lives are always made up of a mixture of great pleasure and great suffering. And yes, there will be times when we might need most of all to focus specifically on joy in order to refill our cup, as the new to me phrase goes, so we can continue our work to make the world a better place for everyone. As some of you know, I'm an historian who wrote an academic book about a crushingly sad story, which I won't go into here. But the question this tag raises has made me remember the feelings my co-writer and I had as we started to talk about how to structure our book. Our fundamental goal was to put one man's experience of pain into a changing historical context. But we realized that if we just listed all of the horrible things that happened to him, it would seem not only inhumane, but inhuman. The man's experience of unbelievable injustice wasn't the only story. It also mattered that he was, at some level, a person of resilience who managed to build a life with dignity. I realize that human dignity is not the same thing as human joy, but I think it might be the prerequisite that allows for joy. We weren't the only historians trying to grapple with what I think is a false binary of pain versus joy. The fundamental split in the social history of slavery in the United States is that scholars tend to emphasize, not exclusively talk about, either the almost unbelievable injustices of the system of slavery or the stunningly powerful ways that enslaved human beings were able to create lives of dignity and connection and even joy. One book's thesis might stress the forced hours in the field, the violence of masters and slave drivers, the sale of children away from their parents, etc. Another book might emphasize the continuity of language and naming patterns and musical traditions, or slaves' ability to create loving, fictive kin relationships, or the self-reliance that could be created in the Black church or enslaved community vegetable gardens. The experiences of resilience and connection really matter here, specifically because of the cauldron of injustice and pain and in which that deep joy or deep meaning was forged. I find it really interesting that both serious fiction and nonfiction are places where suffering is explored very deeply. Unlike the experience so many of us face in our daily lives, where most of the contemporary culture seems to insist on happy endings, literature gives a place to play out how pain can shape and even distort lives, and also how pain and pleasure often interact. That doesn't mean that discussions about pain are at the core of all serious literature. Danielle at Guilty Feet gives an amazing list of beloved and even prize-winning books that fundamentally are not about suffering, and I will steer you to his channel below so you can hear his thoughts. The second half of the tag deals with what I see as a different angle, starting with the idea of guilty pleasure. Many of you have pointed out that we should not feel guilty about reading anything that brings us pleasure, and I definitely agree. But of course, the phrase doesn't actually say we should feel guilty about all pleasure, just on principle. That isn't how adjectives work. Guilty pleasure is only one kind of pleasure, or at least that's how I read it. There's the pleasure of picking beautiful salad greens from our vegetable gardens and proudly serving them to our families. That pleasure's full of what is good for us, nutrients, self-reliance, connection to others. And then there are guilty pleasures, perhaps the decadent chocolate cake that is a wonderful treat and not at all shameful, but not necessarily something we would appreciate quite so much if it was all we ate. In my world, the usage of guilty pleasure always means an excellent treat. But even if you take the phrase literally, it means the particular kind of pleasure we feel guilty about, not the fact that all pleasure should make us feel guilty. Another kind of pleasure is cathartic pleasure. When we read something heartbreaking or cry in the theater, we're working through emotions of pain, and that experience of immersing ourselves in pain helps us come to terms with our own difficult emotions. And that coming to terms allows us a kind of opening to the world and a kind of joy. One last response here. In my irregular series of posts, Reads and Rambles, I often talk about the New York Times Book Review. One of my favorite features in the book review is the By the Book section, where writers and celebrities of some sort answer what are usually bookish questions. One frequently recurring question is, do you count any books as guilty pleasures? Well, the interview this past week was Stacey Abrams, the brilliant Georgia politician and political thinker who led the charge that turned Georgia blue, and the author of many books, including a set of romances. I love her whole interview and might talk more about it sometime soon. But for now, let me share part of her answer for this particular question. She starts by saying that no, she doesn't count any books with good writing and good storytelling as a guilty pleasure, whether it is, as she says, a serial killer thriller or a philosopher's biography. Then she goes on to talk about the diversity of what she has written, saying that her first book was on the operational dissonance of business income tax or something, And that when she published her first novel, a romance, she decided to publish it under a pseudonym. Abrams doesn't call attention to it, but she turns our assumptions around. She says, I made the very reasonable assumption that someone looking for a romance would not trust a tax policy wonk, rather than saying that someone looking for a nerdy book about tax policy wouldn't trust a writer of romances. She's making it clear that she feels no shame about writing and enjoying other kinds of books. As she says, I've been privileged to write in romance, thriller, leadership, and politics. Nothing that tells a good story should ever cause chagrin. Okay, I'm off to go read an embarrassingly depressing book about a subject I don't exactly hide or really keep secret, but which I very rarely mention here on BookTube. Maybe I will come clean in a future video. Take care, everybody. Thanks for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.